So I've got a special for you this week on Book Club because it is, of course, the 80th anniversary of VE Day. So I've got a very special guest for you. We're going to be diving into the captivating world of historical fiction with Kate Quinn. She is the best-selling author of The Alice Network. Known for her gripping storytelling and meticulous research, Kate brings to life the extraordinary, often overlooked women of history. The Alice Network is a powerful tale of espionage, resilience, and redemption, and it weaves together the stories and timelines of two women during the First and Second World Wars. So, Kate Quinn, welcome so much to my book club on Brooklands Radio. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's delightful to actually meet you.
It is really nice, yes. Well, let's get back to basics because even the other day, somebody mentioned to me they just finished The Alice Network. It came out in, I think, 2017. So it's not your most recent book by far. And I believe you've had something like 17 books and anthologies out. But it is obviously very, very poignant at the moment when we're talking about war and commemorating it. Can you tell me what it was, the true story, if you like, that inspired you to get behind those stories and write The Alice Network?
Well, as with any novel that I write, that moment of inspiration most often comes for me less about a historical period and more about when I happen to find some amazing woman or group of women who have done something truly astounding and courageous and jaw-dropping. And when my jaw has dropped and when I have thought, I have to know more about this. How did I not know about this? That's when I know I have something that I think perhaps I could hang a book on. And for the Alice Network, it was finding out about the women of the real Alice Network, which was the network of spies run in World War I by Louise de Bettigny, who is nicknamed the Queen of Spies. And it was the most successful spy network of that war, even though it was only in operation for about 9 months to a year. And as soon as I knew more about Louise and this amazing group of most of the women who she worked with, I really wanted to know more and I wanted to shine a light on them. And that's really how that particular book was inspired. Although, as I say, with any book of mine, it's almost always going to begin with that hook of I find out about an amazing woman or group of women and then I must know more.
Yes, and in this case, of course, it was the spy network, which was barely known about, barely written about, barely acknowledged, but played quite a big part in the war, didn't it?
Yes, they actually were spectacularly successful. The British High Command, were absolutely gushed over the precision and accuracy of the intelligence that this network passed on. And, it was definitely a blow when the network was finally brought down, in part by its own success. It's not like the Germans could fail to notice that there was a whole section of their front that they could not keep artillery on without it getting bombed out and otherwise taken down. So they were in some ways a victim of their own success, but, it was a dazzling little period of intelligence, brilliance that really did its part for their own side in the war.
And in many ways, it was because they were women that they went under the radar, that they were sort of dismissed as couldn't possibly be offering anything or gathering intelligence on that level, which I think contributed to their success, didn't it?
It really did. And that's one of the reasons why women in espionage actually have always been a natural fit, not just in World War I, but in almost any period. And that is because for the very simple reason that women have quite often the ability to pass unnoticed where men in the same position would be stopped and checked or would be suspected of something. But women do pass unnoticed. And Louise de Bettigny was certainly an absolute genius at being able to get intelligence across, fortified borders and so forth, simply because she had so many ways of being able to, make the guards, think that she was not a threat. And that was everything from, playing up the ditzy female who is, juggling her shopping or, hiding things in, extremely innocuous spaces, inside umbrella staffs or shoe heels or around hiding tiny messages around the band of a ring, being able to, playing the ditz who, oh, I forgot my pass. Well, can I just go through? She had this ability to be able to waft across and, appear to be so innocuous or so much not a threat that she could always get through. And she even said, with a little self-possession, any piece of paper you poke under their nose, you can always get through.
Very wily, good actressing skills as well. So it's really interesting the way that you have managed to have these two timelines sort of almost parallel with each other, two women in two wars. And actually, those wars weren't that far apart, were they? So, I mean, 40 years between World War One and World War Two, France has still got a bit of a hangover from the First World War. And that's still sort of affecting their feelings towards people from other countries and the way they conduct themselves. Tell me a little bit more about how you managed to weave those timelines. That must be a really, really intricate and difficult thing to do.
To do not only World War One, but a World War Two or a post World War Two story as well. And, so that there would be unfinished business from one war that has to finish in the second timeline, when it has lain dormant for, several decades. But really, one of the things that really came out of my research was the more research I did, the more it became clear to me, exactly as you say, that there really was this hangover from World War One that is still very much present by World War II. And that's not the way history is really taught in the United States. I mean, we are fortunate enough that this war was not fought on our turf. And so therefore, these two wars are presented as two separate historical incidents, two separate historical events. But it really wasn't. The more you look at it, when you're looking at it, especially from the point of view of territory that was tramped over repeatedly in both wars, Belgium and France especially, is that this really is more like one war that happened to have a 30-year detente in the middle. And there are these emotional and physical wounds for the people who especially were in occupied territory that are nowhere near healing when, from World War One, by the time, the tanks come rolling in for World War Two. And that's really something I wanted to dig into in the Alice Network, was exactly how those wounds are still present and how there is so much unfinished business and so many unfinished emotional stresses and stressors, and those things still have to be dealt with.
I mean, it was really just one generation apart, in effect, wasn't it? And now, with 80 years since the war finished, we're now looking at the very end generation who can really still remember those times. We're looking at people in their late 80s and 90s who were there and can still talk about their experiences. So can I ask you a bit more, because you're known for your research, you're really meticulous with it, and you come from a real love of history. How did you get into the research for the Alice Network? Did you go to France, or did you do most of this sort of online and through interviews?
Able to actually travel to France because it was not in the budget or in the schedule the year I was writing, but it was a lot of the research was fortunately there was a lot of research that I was able to do from books, and that was from trial records and from various memoirs and so forth about Louise and about her and from her compatriots. The woman who was sort of her second in command wrote a memoir, or rather, her journalist husband wrote a memoir of their war work, which was really which was really quite useful to me, since that gave me a lot of details for how things were transpiring on the ground. I was lucky enough that a good friend of mine actually not only has French roots from that area, but we actually discovered that in her family archives, I think it was her great uncle and great aunts were involved in the Alice Network, and they had some letters and papers that were talked about it a little bit, and just gave a lot of the atmosphere for what it was like to be living in Lille underneath German occupation at that time. And with their permission, I even put her family members in there as very minor characters, which is a lot of fun. But it was a lot too. I don't speak French fluently enough for that, so I was working the translation apps over time, and I was relying on my bilingual friends to help me out sometimes with tricky translations. But the research was really rewarding. I mean, because I do think that World War One can be was somewhat subsumed by World War Two coming after it. But it's it has its own history, it has its own flavor, it has its own issues about it, and it was really felt very rewarding to dig into, because, as we said earlier, so much of it was just setting the stage for World War II, and the same issues carried over.
Well, what you've done is a really clever blend of truth and fiction. So you have these real people who actually existed, and then you've integrated in the fictional characters that you've obviously made up through Eve and through Charlie. Tell me a little bit about the nemesis between Eve and Renee. How did you work that in? Because it's a fierce nemesis. He's a worthy enemy, isn't he?
I love the dynamic of cat and mouse, when you especially have the idea of there's a powerful man and then there's a woman who has only her wits to try to get around him. And cat and mouse as a dynamic works best when it's a very smart cat. So he is someone who is very much Eve's nemesis. And I knew I wanted to give her someone who is a personal enemy, not just, the big global enemy of the Germans, the nation that is fighting yours. I wanted to give her a personal one. And I wanted to make him a Frenchman because diving into that whole issue of collaboration, the word collaborator is still a very, very loaded word and a loaded concept. And it remained that World War I and World War II. Sometimes it was applied very unfairly. People who were accused of collaborating when, really they're just trying to, keep their head down and survive. There was also no doubt that there were people who quite literally, fed their own countrymen to their enemies if it meant getting ahead themselves. And so I wanted to make Renee an enemy like that, and someone who is, should technically be on her side, but is not. And I wanted to make him a worthy enemy in that he is very smart, very hard to fool, and that she's really going to have her work cut out for her if she is going to fool him and if she is going to continue to practice as a spy right under his nose, which is what she does, since he operates a restaurant which serves the Germans and the high command in the occupied region, and Eve works at that restaurant, and he doesn't know that she speaks German and is listening to every word that the patrons are saying and passing that along. So I had a lot of fun with that because I always, as I said, I enjoy a good cat and mouse, and their scenes are some of the most fun to write because she always has to be thinking 10 steps ahead and always has to be in perfect control of every muscle of her face or he will smell a rat.
She's super smart, isn't she? And as I said earlier, sort of an amazing actress to get across what she was trying to portray and to keep the wool over his eyes for as long as possible. I wanted to ask you as well about the bravery of female spies, which really was overlooked. Do you feel like your novel shone a light on it? And did you get people writing to you saying, thank you for doing this, for actually highlighting what they have done? And it's been sort of so overshadowed and so sort of not part of the main history because, it's full of the trenches and the Battle of Britain and all the war playing, the big dramatic activity. Did you get a lot of feedback from people whose ancestors, whose relatives were spies during the war?
I have gotten some of that, and that's been really very rewarding. Or even if it hasn't been from relatives, it's been from people who said, I didn't know about this. I wasn't taught about these women in school. And that's true. There does tend to be a focus on, the male heroes who are part of this fight in both wars. And yet women have played a huge part in both wars. And I think especially in espionage, there was a tendency afterwards that no one knew quite what to do with these women. I know for the women of the Alice Network, once it was done, it's like, yes, they were acknowledged as heroes, but in ways that, emphasized their femininity and their patriotism, not necessarily like their toughness, their resourcefulness, their cunning, not the traits that, were viewed as unfeminine. And that there was this sort of worry too about like, well, we want to make sure that they didn't compromise themselves as ladies in the course of their work. And, of course, the women on the ground must have been like, no, we were not thinking about, for God's sake, we had a war to fight. We weren't thinking about that. It's like, why are you thinking about that? But they were. And this continues to go on in wars, like women can contribute, but how they contribute sometimes is very worrying to the men at the time. I mean, I remember being surprised during, the Battle of Britain that there was a law passed that women could work on the anti-aircraft guns in London, but they couldn't pull the trigger. They could do the maintenance, they could do the calculations, but a male officer had to be the one who actually pulled the trigger. The ladies cannot do that. And I just thought, you're in the middle of the Battle of Britain and you stopped to pass a law about this? Like,
yeah, that was so important to you to do that, to waste time. In fact, there was a wonderful woman. I think she just reached her 100th birthday. And she was one of these women who worked on the airplanes, putting it together during the war. And she finally got to go up in one of these airplanes. I think it was last year. And she was 100. And how amazing was that, she finally got to have that ride. Now, the other thing that I think you've done really well is to shine a light on PTSD, which was not discussed. And PTSD in women, even less so. How did you manage to do that so authentically and to portray it so heartbreakingly?
Well, it's something I'm very familiar with. I'm a Navy wife, and my husband's been in the military for close to 20 years, and it means that I've had a very up close look at the military life and what it does to people, not just through him, but through a lot of his friends. And I have actually gotten to know quite a few women in the service as well, who have become friends of mine. So I know what PTSD looks like, and that there is no standard way that it affects people. It affects everyone differently, and people have very different coping mechanisms for how they, do deal with these war wounds once the war is over. And it's something that remains fascinating to me, is not just wartime, but aftermath. Because when you're in the middle of a war, you are in survival mode. You are only thinking, I'm just going to get through this and, get through to the other side, get through to when the war is over and when I'm still alive. But then when you're there, when you're standing in the rubble and looking around you, and you have to think, well, what now? How do I put my life back together? Can I put my life back together? That was, one of the things I really did want to examine in the Alice Network, is how all the characters in it are to some degree suffering from PTSD. You have Eve, who is, and they all cope differently. You have Eve, who is, has been tortured in the war and has suffered imprisonment and loss, who copes, frankly, with a whole lot of alcohol and isolation and anger. You have Finn, the driver, who is an ex-soldier from World War I, who literally was at the camp liberations and has probably copes with that with what we would now call, he has some anger management issues. You have Charlie, who was relatively sheltered during the war. She's an American. She did not see any kind of combat or anything on the ground like an occupation, but her family was torn apart because her brother was a soldier and he ended up committing suicide. And her whole family is, kind of destroyed by this, including her. And she suffers from what would now be called depression because of this. And all of these people, and the various other people that they know, they all suffer from PTSD in some way or other, shape or form, and they're all trying to move on. And this book is, in a lot of ways, it's about how at least this little group all does find some way to move on and create a better life for themselves than they had, at least at the book's beginning.
Was that important to you then, that Eve should find some kind of redemption in the end? We don't really talk much about what she did in World War II, because she did play a role in World War II, but that's quite sort of on the down low, should we say. It's not really featured.
I left that open for myself. I am not 100% sure what she did in World War II. I know some of it, but I wanted to leave that open in case that was ever something to revisit, and maybe someday I will. But yes, I wanted to, leave that a little bit deliberately in the shade. But her war work in World War I, is quite harrowing enough, and it leaves her with, these wounds that still have in no way healed 30 years later.
And of course, she's still very young. By the time we're into World War II, she's only in her early 50s, isn't she? So, I mean, she still potentially has an awful lot of life to live, because, 50 is not the end of your life.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to have her, still be able to put her life together by the end, is that, she does have a lot of years left in front of her, hopefully. And I was also thinking, it's like, I do get annoyed in books when, the woman in her 50s is older is sort of written off as the mentor character. And, she's there to like dispense wise advice to the 20-something who gets the actual adventure. And I wanted very much for Eve to be still the heroine, a capital H heroine who has, a fight to finish, who has an enemy to find, who is very much driving the train on their particular adventure. And it's the younger woman who is sort of like hanging on for dear life and trying to dispense advice that it's like, maybe she's trying to dispense the advice that will hopefully not get the capital H heroine killed.
Exactly. I mean, they're both strong women in very different ways, and it's just such a beautiful tale, so intertwined. Do you what was I gonna say? Sorry, I just want to look this up because there's a couple of questions I didn't want to miss with you. We covered collaboration. We covered historical figures. Well, I suppose, well, one of the one of the most obvious things to me is when I read it, and I read it a long time ago, and I reread it to chat with you today. But it reads to me so obviously like a movie. I mean, it's just got vistas and scenes that are so clearly give themselves to a visual representation. And I'm really surprised. I know it's been optioned, but nothing is, it's sitting there just waiting. Is it moving in any way? Could we hope to see this on our screens? Do you know what's happening?
It's been, as I said, it's been optioned, but that's all I know right now. There's been no particular forward movement. So who knows? At one point it would be lovely to see it make the screen, but I really don't have much control over that. Hollywood moves very slowly and very erratically, and the option is only the very first step in a long and arduous process of getting a book to a screen. So fingers crossed. I hope it'll happen someday.
I know authors don't tend to get a say in the people who play their characters, but I have seen interviews before where you have said you've got your dream cast. Who do you see as your main characters, from actors who are out there now?
I think I always thought Emma Thompson would make a lovely Eve for the older
Oh my
Eve.
gosh. Yes, she would, because she's got that sharpness of wit. And
Yes, and that's what you need for her. And then you'd probably need another actress for the younger Eve. I think someone like Mia Wasikowska or like Alicia Vikander would be good. I like Michael Huisman a lot. I think he'd make, or Richard Madden. They would be lovely Scots for Finn.
For Finn, yes.
And there was a actress called Ksenia Solo who is she's all like attitude and chin and elbows, and I always thought she would make a good Charlie.
There's so many great options out there. I really do hope it's made into a movie because it is so visual. And, we are now part of that generation that is starting to forget. So we're relying on stories. We're relying on, and historians like you to bring these things to life and to keep them in our heads so that we don't forget how awful it was back then. Because the longer the time away from it, it's a bit like COVID, isn't it? The longer the time away from that moment, it's harder to remember just how terrible it really was. Well, Kate Quinn.
I think that's why we have this, there's been this glut of World War II stories. But if you think, the thing is that's a relatively recent phenomenon over the last 10 to 15 years. I mean, there was a time when, the common wisdom in the publishing world was you couldn't sell a World War II story to save your life. No one wanted to hear it. And it may have just been, did it feel like it was too soon? Because there is that where people don't want to talk about something because it's too fresh. But I think that we hit a certain point, maybe 10, maybe 15 years ago. I'm not exactly sure when we did, but we did, when I think there was this realization that, the World War II veterans, the people who remember this history are aging out. We're going to lose them. And we need to hear these stories while they're here to tell them. And if we don't write them down, we're going to lose them. And, I don't know about you, but if you have anyone in your family who has lived through the war or any war, they usually don't talk about it much. I mean, my grandfather was in Korea, and he didn't talk about it until the very end of his life. And I know a lot of people who were involved in World War II. It's a similar thing. They weren't necessarily sharing these details unless maybe they are probed to do so. But there is now, and it still continues to be, I think, this this fascination now with the World War II stories, just because we want to hear them while we can. And I think that's why there has been so much in the way of historical fiction that centers around World War II. And I bet we'll even see more now that we're, we have the 80th anniversary.
I think so too. Well, Kate Quinn, you are an incredible writer. What have you got lined up? Are you working on anything at the moment? What's your latest?
Well, I have the paperback release of my latest book, which is The Briar Club, and that is a post-war story, actually. But there's still that hangover from World War II, as we've been talking about, that is still there, and you can still see it in some of the characters. That's set in America in the 1950s during the Red Scare, McCarthyism, and all of that.
Yeah.
So that's going to be coming out this year in paperback, and then after
very
that,
timely, I must say, Kate. This whole McCarthyism and the political climate, I think that could touch a nerve.
It was more on on the nose than I really had in mind when I was writing it.
I'm sure.
So there was a lot there that resonated with today's environment. I have to say, more than I wish was true, but it's still unfortunately applicable.
Well, congratulations. I have got a copy of The Briar Club, and it's in paperback. Is it in paperback in the UK already? The Briar Club?
In April?
Yeah, I think it's just about to come out. Yeah, so definitely would recommend that one. And of course, if people haven't read The Alice Network, I would absolutely dive back into that because it's a wonderful novel. Kate, thank you so much for spending time with us on this book club special all about VE Day and remembering World War II. And thanks so much for being with us.
No, thank you so much for having me.